Farewell, and adieu to you, Spanish ladies. Farewell, and adieu to you, ladies of Spain. For we have received orders for to sail to old England. We hope in a short time to see you again. So we rant and we roll like true British sailors. We rant and we roll along the South Seas until we strike soundings in the Channel of England. From Eushan to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues. So we rant and we roll like true British sailors. We rant and we roll along the South Seas until we strike soundings in the Channel of Old England. From Eushan to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues.
The corvette was born out of a dire need at the beginning of World War II for something to fill the gap until the larger destroyers could be brought online. The design was an untested one based on a whaling ship. On a corvette, 3 days at sea, anything that was breakable was broken. Riding in a corvette, working, recreation time, sleeping, was extremely rough, noisy, and dirty. The sailor's life is at best a life of danger. He pursues honor on the mountain wave and finds it in the battle and in the storm. Never did more distinguished chivalry display itself than in the conduct of our seamen during the Battle of the Atlantic. At sea, I learned how little a person needs. On September 1st, 1943, on the 4th anniversary of the start of World War II, a corvette-class warship entered the water for the first time in Kingston, Ontario. With a fresh coat of paint and bearing pennant code K368, it would go on to fight for and protect the Allies on the open seas of the Atlantic and across the English Channel. For a little over a year and a half before the events of late February 1945, the warship and her crew would play their part in the largest maritime force in human history, in the largest war in history. This is the story of that ship and the men who sailed on her, HMCS Trentonian of the Royal Canadian Navy. The early spring dawn broke over Trenton as Mayor H.R. Corey sat down at his desk at Trenton Town Hall. He picked up the newspaper, tucked in with the morning mail. It was early April 1943, and like most of the residents of this small eastern Ontario town, the war with Germany dominated his thoughts. It also dominated the news. He scanned the headlines and set the paper aside. There was simply too much to attend to for a thorough read this morning. He grabbed the mail and, thumbing through the envelopes, he noticed one that stood out from the usual. It was from the Royal Canadian Navy. He opened it first. From the Naval Board of the Department of National Defense, it explained that the custom of navies was to name certain classes of ships after people or places, and that the Canadian Navy, following this custom, had decided to name corvettes and minesweepers after cities and towns in Canada. The letter went on to state, HMCS Trentonian has been named after your town. The letter also explained how communities supplied comforts to the crews of their namesake vessels that the Navy didn't provide. Magazines, books, extra clothing like mittens and sweaters, or other items like radios, blankets, and washing machines. It ended with a request. Would the people of Trenton, or some organization in the community, consider adopting the corvette HMCS Trentonian? Mayor Corey looked out the window and smiled with pride. He knew the citizens of Trenton were more than ready to step up to the request. They would gladly help out the Canadian boys of the new ship Trentonian. Ignoring the rest of the mail, the mayor immediately contacted the newspaper, the Trenton Courier Advocate, to break the good news to the people of Trenton. On April 15th, newsboys fanned out across the town to deliver their charges to the townspeople. As the newspaper landed on residences and business doorsteps, the headline read, "Trenton ship must have best," says Mayor. The community responded with all the heart and enthusiasm that Corey anticipated, with one woman in particular leading the charge, Miss Hazel Farley. Hazel was a teacher at Trenton High School. She had been engaged to a soldier who had died in World War I and had already been writing to every single Trenton High student or graduate who had gone to Europe. The call to action ran something deep inside of her, and she immediately began organizing to heed the call.
Oh, I was so proud to have a ship named after Trenton. Our community had given so much toward the effort for such a small place, and many of my previous students were already in Europe, where I am certain they were making good use of their French lessons. I contacted Mayor Corey immediately.
After speaking with the mayor, she spearheaded the support for the ship's crew. In just a matter of days, other members of the community jumped on board. And in May, a Trenton branch of the Navy League of Canada was established, followed shortly thereafter by a Navy League Cadet Corps. The ship and her crew would prove to be very well taken care of by the citizens of Trenton. Meanwhile, the ship itself was being constructed just a short distance away on Lake Ontario. In a world of clanging, banging, and the twang of steel ringing against steel, amongst the heat and shimmer of the welders, the workers of the Kingston Shipbuilding Company were hard at work on Trentonian. The hull and main structure would be completed and ready by the end of August, after a record pace of construction. When word of its imminent launch went out, a group of citizens from Trenton, including Mayor Corey and his wife, and Hazel Farley and members of the committee organized to supply the vessel all traveled to Kingston for the ceremony. Mayor Corey's wife was delegated to christen the ship and swung a bottle of champagne on a rope to break against the hull. But the support blocks holding the ship in dry dock were removed at the same moment, and the bottle swung back to her, having completed its arc and missed entirely as the ship slid into the water. A nearby worker grabbed it off the rope and threw it with force, smashing it against the hull and saving the christening. Yes, the ship had been christened, but it wasn't yet ready for war. The second stage of construction was to begin in earnest as the ship bobbed on the water at Kingston. Some 6 months later, on November 11th, Trentonian's first crew members stepped aboard. Lieutenant Harrison was making his way to Kingston, Ontario with the officers of his new ship. The Canadian native of Ireland had joined the Canadian Navy Volunteer Reserve in May of 1941 after a background in the Merchant Navy, and had commanded 2 ships previously, the Husky and the Lunenburg, for 2 years of escorting convoys in eastern Canada and Great Britain. He was looking over the information regarding Trentonian and her namesake, the fact that the city of Trenton had graciously organized and had already begun sending items to Kingston for the crew, organized by one Hazel Farley. Harrison knew well the dedication to the national cause that Trenton was so familiar with and a part of. The city had hosted the nation's largest flying training center at RCAF Trenton since 1931. However, the city had known its fair share of wartime danger as well. The explosion at the British chemical munitions plant on Thanksgiving Day in 1918 had rained havoc across most of the city, pulverizing windows, throwing detritus thousands of feet, and causing mass evacuations. As he came ever closer to Kingston, Harrison thought that in light of the dedication and courage of real Trentonians, the ship bore the perfect namesake. Harrison and his officers arrived in Kingston at the shipyard and immediately approached the hull of the ship. It was ready for the water, and members of the community of Trenton would soon be on hand for the official launch. The first of the ratings would be arriving soon, and he was eager to meet his officers. Lieutenant William Burley Kingsman, second in command, was a native of Vancouver. He greeted Harrison with a strong, firm handshake. Lieutenant L.P. Parr, navigation officer, was quiet but keen. 2 sub-lieutenants, C.H. LaRose and D.J. Dodds, were Trentonian's gunnery officer and submarine officer, respectively.
Senior officers and I boarded the ship just ahead of the first crew. We were given a brief tour and shown to our quarters. Of course, at the time, the ship still needed a lot of work. But some of the gifts from the people of Trenton had already arrived, and I determined that I would make a visit to that city before we departed Kingston. It was about this time that the first ratings arrived aboard the vessel to assist in the first round of testing. And one of the first to set foot on the deck was a young man named Alan Singleton.
Alan Singleton was from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and came aboard Trentonian as the sick bay attendant, or Tiffy, in Navy slang. He was young, but eager. He was also an avid amateur photographer, and boarded with his box camera tucked under one arm.
I was surprised when the lieutenant clapped me on the shoulder, but then he mentioned my camera and I understood. Now, I am no way a professional photographer, and I told him it was more of a hobby. But I was also glad to have that personal interaction, and that he didn't care I had brought it along.
The other executive officers had lined the rail of Trentonian to greet the first ratings as they climbed the gangway. They each shook his hand in turn as the other crew members filed on behind him. The first few seamen were needed to conduct the open water tests on the new ship. Over the next few weeks, the tests were conducted. These were interesting at first, but quickly became tedious. During those first weeks on board Trentonian, Alan Singleton remembered days on end of what seemed like the same thing happening over and over. Speed tests, turns to check the rudder, running the engine in various conditions.
It was boring after a while. The sickbay wasn't really needed yet. There were a few small scrapes, but nothing serious. I spent a lot of time during those early days assisting when I could, but it was mostly waiting.
On December 1st, another contingent from Trenton came for the raising of the White Ensign and the launch of the now seaworthy vessel, and for the first time step on board. Alan Singleton spent the day moving among the flesh and blood Trentonians as they explored and marveled at their steel namesake. He regularly brought out his camera and asked for poses. The feeling in the air was one of accomplishment, pride, and wonder. The ratings that had lived aboard for a month or more had already made it feel like home, but the supplies and gifts the people of the small city brought with them added the personal touch of a community's worth of support. The gifts were placed in the ship with care, the mittens and the coats and clothing handed out to men by size and fit. A gramophone was placed in the mess, and even a piano made its way aboard, after being taken apart to fit through the doorway. Other provisions and supplies were loaded over the next 2 days, and the Trentonian left the docks of the Kingston Shipbuilding Company for the last time on December 3rd. As the ship launched, fully operational for the first time, but still missing some armaments and the ASDIC system which would be installed in Quebec and Nova Scotia, Singleton swelled with pride despite the cold. He swiveled his camera around to capture the view of Kingston as the Trentonian angled out into Lake Ontario. After taking a few moments to feel the breeze against his face and peer off into a future he couldn't begin to anticipate, he turned from the deck to head down to his sickbay. Joe Taft, one of the ship's cooks, called down after him.
I remember seeing Singleton on that deck as we left Kingston. Of course, I'd seen a camera before, but I didn't expect to see one on the deck of a warship. He was an odd sight. Little guy pressing his face against that thing, turning it this way and that. When he packed up, I remember hollering at him, "Too bad we don't have a dark room, eh, pal?" Little did I know it gave him an idea.
The trip up the St. Lawrence was rather uneventful. A 3-day stop in Montreal saw more crew board the vessel. Singleton watched from the foredeck as the fresh faces boarded the Trentonian. One of these was a stoker from Carbon, Alberta, named Sidney Coates, and he looked relieved if a little weary. Singleton saw the same man that afternoon in the mess hall and approached him.
Oh boy, was I tired that first day. It's no wonder Singleton mentioned it in the mess hall. He said something like, "You're looking a mite better than you did coming aboard this morning." Well, I told him these accommodations were a lot better than what I had been used to.
Coates told me he had been on 2 ships previously and had been awaiting reassignment for weeks in Montreal, arriving every day to attend morning parade to see if his name was called to a ship. One morning, he missed the call because he had come out of the city the night before with a friend.
We overslept. We woke up and realized our mistake and rushed as fast as we could back to roll call.
They missed the division call. Coates was considered AWOL and he was placed in a cell for 7 days. After a grueling imprisonment consisting of poor rations and a demanding training routine, he was released and assigned to the Trentonian.
So you can see, I was on a very terrible vacation, and I was looking forward to duty.
It wasn't hard to make friends during such times, and the crew continued to get a feel for each other as the ship made its way east. A few days later, the ship arrived at Quebec City. The crew noticed the temperature drop inside the ship, even though new insulation had just been installed. At this time, another group of men joined the crew. There were now 88 men aboard Trentonian. Soon, every mess hall and many of the quarters had become an icebox. Every meal or moment spent in the mess was accompanied by a lot of hand-rubbing, cursing, and visible exhalations of breath. Men were sleeping in layers of clothes just to find some comfort.
Then one morning at breakfast, someone noticed icicles hanging off the deckheads. "That's it," the guy hollered. "Either they heat this tub up, or I leave the ship." A few men rose to go with them, and off they went to find the coxswain.
After much complaining and other threats of desertion, Harrison called for the engineers on shore to look into it. An investigation was done, and it was discovered that the blowers for the heaters in the ventilation had been installed backwards. Instead of blowing stale air out, it was sucking cold air from outside in. After this repair, the ship became much more comfortable, and the crew played cards, wrote letters home, and otherwise enjoyed their first warm night in some days. Later in the voyage, When men complained it was too cool, Singleton and some of the first crewmen would recount those first 2 weeks in the icebox of their mess. They also received more gifts from the city of Trenton. Lieutenant Harrison spent some part of the afternoon writing a letter to Miss Farley of the Trenton Corvette Committee to thank her for the supplies. He also thanked her for starting a pen pal program with the local students. Meanwhile, the recently delivered Afghan coats were distributed amongst the crew.
I was in the middle of reading a letter from a high schooler in Trenton when a weight fell on me and I was in sudden darkness. With a whiff of cinnamon. "Hey, what is this?" I yelled down the hall. "It's your very own Afghan from the citizens of Trenton," one of the crew called back to me as they carried on. I tried to find the scent of winter baking on the blanket, but it was lost. It gave me a brief glimpse of my grandmother and my first real twinge of homesickness. Home had always smelled of baking during the month of December.
Although the ship was ready to go, orders had been delayed due to the weather. Then they were delayed again as the storm continued. On Christmas Eve, Singleton was in the mess having lunch when stoker Sidney Coates came rushing in. All the men looked up from their food as he smiled broadly and explained his excitement.
Oh, I remember how excited I was. Orders had been delayed again, and I was going to see about going ashore Christmas morning. A few of the guys laughed, though. Why on earth would they let you go ashore, Coates? They all laughed this time, but I did it. The next day, a few men were given leave, and I was one of them.
Off he had gone down the gangway, his smile beaming all the while. When he returned that evening, Singleton saw him making his way toward the bunks.
I saw him that evening coming aboard and asked how his day had been. "A Merry Christmas indeed," he said, and told me he had met a couple of nice young ladies, and they had a bit of a skate. He clapped me on the shoulder and continued down the hall. I wonder if that smile left his face all day.
That evening, the men had their Christmas dinner. As is the custom in the Navy on Christmas Day, the youngest member of the crew traded places with the skipper, and his first order of duty was to stand down from normal routine for dinner. Joe Taft and the other cooks prepared a turkey dinner with all the trimmings. The next morning, orders were received and the ship was to depart Quebec City with the corvette Norcid and the tug Norton en route to Halifax. The crew got to work readying the ship for departure. A harbour pilot was brought on board, someone intimately familiar with the hazards and the currents around Quebec City, and the ship made its way into the St. Lawrence. Singleton was in the sick bay, stocking more supplies brought aboard at the last minute, when he was startled out of his work by a thud that shook the ship. Then another, and another. Grabbing his coat, he made his way to the foredeck. Before he had even opened the door at the top of the stairs, he could hear Harrison yelling, "Either the pilot ceases smacking into ice floes immediately, or I will throw him overboard."
The cause of Lieutenant Harrison's anger wasn't clear, so I approached one of the crew on duty. He said the pilot has been ramming the ice. He's gone and popped a few rivets and Harrison won't have it. Well, I was pleased to hear our commanding officer wasn't afraid to assert his authority for the protection of the vessel, even if it was only a harbor pilot. I went back to the sick bay where I had a project in mind and started eyeing up the bulkheads of the room.
It was 3 days' travel to Halifax down the St. Lawrence, the first time the ship had been out of harbour for many of the men. The more immediate problem proved to be seasickness, and the worst affected were two of the cooks, one of whom was practically incapacitated by the condition. With a full complement of 110 men and officers, Trentonian was almost ready for war. On New Year's Eve, the excitement could be felt ship-wide, and most of the crew were granted leave. They polished their shoes and wore their best uniforms. The men made their way to the Salvation Army canteen, and all agreed it was a wonderful night, although Sidney Coates was overheard complaining as they left to return to the ship.
Good food, good company, but no drinks? What kind of New Year's is it without a drink or two?
Over the next month, Trentonian was fitted with more electronics, guns, a large searchlight, and other equipment. The rivets popped by the harbour pilot were repaired, pom-pom and Oerlikon machine guns were mounted and tested. On January 30th, as Harrison was completing a letter to Hazel Farley updating the city of Trenton on their namesake, Orders came down from the senior naval officer in Liverpool. Slip at 1200 tomorrow, Monday, and being in all respects ready for sea, proceed at 12 knots directly to Halifax. Trentonian was complete and ready for service. Now it was time to get the men similarly prepared. 17 days of training commenced for the crew on arrival in Halifax on January 31st. The time was spent on getting the crew familiar with the electronics and stations of the ship. They learned how to work together as a team. Each man was assigned a station with a specific location on board and corresponding responsibilities, both during normal operation and when engaging the enemy. All aspects of their individual jobs were practiced and drilled until every crew member knew their responsibilities and equipment intimately. On February 16th, Trentonian received orders to conduct Hedgehog weapons testing. These were naval mortars, anti-submarine weapons, launched from the deck to approximately 230 meters in front of the ship. This was the range where ASDIC, or sonar detection of submarines, became problematic due to the close proximity. Trentonian also received her first orders later that day. The ship was to sail to Bermuda on the 18th.
The deck was beginning to ice over completely at this point. There were men playing shinny on the foredeck, and someone runs out and says, "We're being posted to Bermuda?" It was almost unbelievable.
Trentonian set sail, fully fueled and fully armed in the company of Kitchener, a recently refitted corvette that would complete its own training in Bermuda. As the ships left the harbor and made their way into the open ocean, the spray from the water quickly congealed on everything they splashed down upon. It wasn't long before ice had gripped the corvette from stem to stern. It clung to every piece of exposed material like a great white coat. Inches thick, it weighed down wires and lines and entombed the railings. It had frozen equipment and armaments exactly as they lay. A ship covered in ice can become dangerously top-heavy, lose stability, and become difficult to maneuver. The crew on duty were turned out onto the deck with hammers and hatchets, picks and shovels to clear the ship of its coat of ice. Alan Singleton climbed up from below deck with his camera.
It was an amazing sight. No one would ever believe a ship could hold so much ice and still remain afloat.
As he snapped his first few photos of the glacial vessel, he heard a voice on the foredeck shouting orders. It was Chief Petty Officer Thomas Raymond Roberts.
The ice was becoming a serious problem. Not only was it covering everything, it was slowing the vessel down, and there was possible concern it would damage the ship. I had to raise my voice above the wind. We need to hack every railing and chip away all this bloody ice. I urged them to be careful with the wiring of the pipes. We didn't need to wreck.
The muted sound of thuds and thwacks filled the air, followed by the jangle of clattering ice. After taking a couple of photos, Singleton retreated back below deck. He was thankful he wasn't on duty for the ice clearing job. The crew woke the next morning to find the temperature had increased substantially overnight. The ship had steered their way south and were leaving the frigid temperatures behind. However, the relief from the icy grip of the northern waters was quickly replaced with a threat from the south, a hurricane. Dark skies preceded a sharp increase in wave height. Orders were issued that no one should be on deck. Soon, towering walls of water 80 to 90 feet high tossed the corvette like a child's toy. The men remained in their messes and bunks as seasickness spread faster than the wind that whirled about them. Only a few men were even capable of maintaining the ship during the storm. They lost contact with Kitchener. Waves of water poured over the ship and found every possible hole or vent to pour into. Seawater swirled down the hallways, every nook and cranny. No one was safe from being sprayed or battered by the violence of the ocean. Everything was soaked as Stoker Coates came off duty.
I had just come from the boiler room, stepped into the stoker's mess, and put my foot down into 2 feet of water. I couldn't believe my eyes, or that one of my mates had managed to sleep during the flood despite the tossing of the ship. When I tried to drain the water into the locker where the anchor chain is stored, I discovered it was flooded too. and it sure didn't smell good.
The mess was literally that. I could barely stand. When I tried to prep dinner, I lost what little lunch I had left. I've made plenty of meals in plenty rough seas before. No trouble. But never anything like this. Thank goodness a couple men were capable and threw something together for those who could eat.
The storm cleared to find Trentonian completely lost. The cloud cover provided no way of affixing a position by star or sun, and their partnership, Kitchener, was nowhere to be seen in any direction. Navigation Officer L.P. Parr could not fulfill his duty.
I was at a total loss to determine our position. Of course, the ship's compass showed which direction we were heading, but were we still north of Bermuda? How far had we been pushed off course? It was completely impossible to say.
Luckily, help was soon gained from HMS Lawson, a Royal Navy frigate, and it was discovered Trentonian was 100 miles east of Bermuda. The course was corrected, and they arrived in the harbour on February 21st. The Kitchener arrived the next day. Trentonian had suffered at the hands of the tempest. The hull had been battered and the deck had sustained damage from the violent force of the waves. The next 2 days consisted of getting the ship's damage repaired. Signalman Jack McIver of Winnipeg was tasked with scrubbing the communication deck.
It was a terrible job. There was seawater and spilled food everywhere, but worst of all was a vomit, some of which was mine. I scrubbed the whole place with caustic soda to the point where the towel fell completely apart. The tiles on the floor, well, they were dissolved by the cleaner. They ended up having to replace the whole floor. I threw out the gloves when I was done. They surprisingly, they had held up.
Training commenced immediately after the stand-down order was lifted. Numerous drills for firefighting, boarding, maneuvering, damage control, gunnery drills, man overboard, even mock battles were conducted in the warm waters of Bermuda. The men fired at test targets. Anti-aircraft guns were practiced with. Even a training submarine was used to bolster the skills of the Aztec operators. There was downtime as well, which included shore leave.
Bermuda was great. Besides keeping busy with all the training, we got to shore a couple of times as well. About 5 bottles of rum down there for 75 cents each and made a killing selling them back in Halifax. And someone tried to bring a monkey on board the ship. They said no ship in the RCN had a monkey as a mascot. But Lieutenant Kingsman spotted it and had the monkey sent back ashore. Oh, and Frank Barron had the good fortune to meet his brother-in-law who was stationed on another ship.
Oh, it was a joy to see him, that was for sure. But he told me that one of his crew had his toes bitten off by a barracuda during evacuation drills. So when the Trentonians staged the same drill not long after, I refused to do it at first. But I was forced to conduct the drill alongside the rest of the crew. Still, I managed to stay on the ladder, because no way I was going to leave my toes in Bermuda.
Day of the evacuation stations, we were missing a man in Section 3. I'm not going to tell you who it was, but he went into the drink with the rest of them.
Orders were received to return to Halifax, and on February 29th, the crew watched as Bermuda shrank on the horizon behind them, while Trentonian steamed north. Slowly, temperatures dropped, and ice began to form on every exposed piece of metal on deck. Trentonian arrived back in Halifax on March 3rd. Harrison ran them through scenario after scenario, calling them to stations repeatedly. On March 11th, Trentonian received orders and returned to Halifax alongside corvettes Bucktouche, Drumheller, and Kitchener, with Harrison designated the senior officer. They arrived in Halifax shortly after midnight on the 12th. A full caliber shoot of the guns was scheduled, and this was completed on the 14th.
For a lot of us, the firing exercise was the first real sense we had our own firepower. Sure, they had fired the guns before, but not all at once and not with the same sense of intent. There could be no mistaking it now. We were aboard a warship.
Trentonian was now officially operational. They were assigned to the Western Local Escort Force, Group W10. and left Halifax on March 15th in the company of the River-class frigate New Glasgow and corvettes Louisburg II and Drumheller, the commander of the latter being the senior officer. Later that day, they met up with 62 merchant ships, which had departed New York on March 13th en route to Liverpool, UK, escorted by the minesweeper Winnipeg and corvettes Timmins, Trail, and Cobalt. Together, these ships were Convoy HX-283.
I was off duty when we joined up with the merchant ships and the other warships coming up from New York, and I took the opportunity to stand on deck. It had been quite a while since I'd been posted into a convoy, and it really is quite the sight to see so many ships traveling together so tightly.
I was in the sick bay that afternoon. I had just strung up some wires across the bulkheads at the back of the room, the first pieces of a makeshift darkroom. It wouldn't get in the way of the medical equipment or supplies, and I was excited to get some of my photographs developed. Anyway, one of the boys came in to tell me we were approaching the convoy and I had to get my camera and come on deck.
A few had come up to watch as well, and I noticed Singleton was standing 50 paces away with his camera, only he wasn't even looking through the box. He just gaped.
For the first couple of minutes, I just stared. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This giant mass of metal and men churning towards us. I mean, I'd seen wide open spaces, and our first day in open ocean had reminded me of home. Kinda. This was awe-inspiring. Little did I know then what sights I would see from that deck.
The convoy made their way toward Liverpool with Trentonian at her station, zigzagging along in front of the convoy, providing a defensive shield to the merchant ships while also constantly scanning the depths below for German subs with their ASDIC system. For 3 days they traveled this way until orders were received from Halifax to detach from the convoy to search out a possible submarine contact. On March 18th, numerous ships, including Trentonian, made their way to the area where a sonar buoy had picked up the contact, approximately 150 nautical miles south of Halifax. New Glasgow and Trentonian were the first vessels on the scene, approximately 15 hours after the last contact with the submarine.
Now, us ASDIC operators had a lot of training on the system, with dummy subs and everything, and we all felt confident that we'd find that U-boat. But every time my shift ended and I peeled off the headphones, I secretly hoped it would stay hidden a while longer. I wanted to be the first one to report a real U-boat contact.
By the 20th, no new contact had been made, and to the dismay of at least one ASDIC operator, Trentonian was ordered back to Halifax. While at port, Harrison received a letter forwarded by the Navy Board from the city of Trenton, acknowledging receipt of the adoption papers and listing all the supplies so far sent by the citizenry: musical instruments, clothes, games, puzzles, and the personal hygiene supplies were all provided by the proud citizens of Trenton. The Navy Board had replied with a letter thanking the city for providing such a wealth of material to the crew and contained a list of supplies still needed, including a washing machine. As most of the crew washed their clothing with a washboard and bucket, a washing machine would be a real boon to the ship. And so, of course, back in Trenton, Hazel Farley was on the case.
I've hand-washed my fair share of laundry, and I can speak directly to how much physical effort goes into it. If those young men were anything like the ones I've known, they have plenty of courage, honor, and ability. But getting a bad grease stain out isn't a priority. I knew we in the community could step in.
While Miss Farley began organizing the purchase of a washing machine for the Trentonian, some of the stokers had come up with their own solution to the problem.
I think it started out as a joke about throwing all our stinking clothes overboard, but it turned into an idea and wasn't long before we had a rig set up made of an old milk can with holes drilled all through it. We put a latch on the top, tied a long line to her, and stuffed it full of dirty clothes. We'd throw it overboard while the ship was underway, and an hour later, poof! Clean clothes. You just had to beat the salt out of it once they dried.
However, for those who are still doing laundry the old-fashioned way, a machine would make a real difference. Trentonian received orders to escort a convoy from Halifax to Liverpool, It would be the first of many such excursions, meeting merchant vessels, escorting them to a mid-sea rendezvous with the next convoy, turning back to Halifax. Rolling across the water at low speed because the merchant ships were so lollygagging slow, keeping eyes on the water and the sky while cutting the familiar back and forth zigzag at the head of the convoy, the men working the ASDIC system, sweeping the water for enemy contacts, ears tuned in and warmed by the headphones that gave them tabs on the sounds undersea. The stokers, like coats down below in the belly of Trentonian, keeping the oil flowing to the engines, and the mechanical elements in working order. Radio operators always at the ready. The ASDIC operators had been well trained to identify contacts on their equipment, and frequently, as the ship passed over the Grand Banks, operators such as Gordon Gibbons would make regular reports of anything on the screen. One afternoon, Harrison was on the bridge when he noticed a contact on screen. He called the ASDIC hut to identify, and the operator replied it was a biological contact already reported to the officer of the watch. Harrison ordered the ship turned around and brought directly above the contact. Then he ordered a single depth charge dropped as the ship moved over the signal. The crew wondered what this was about. Simply more training. Harrison once again ordered the ship brought back to the location of the contact.
I had no idea what was happening. I had been in the sick bay attending to a few minor abrasions when we felt the ship initiate a sharp turn. And the guy I'm tending to looks up at me, concerned. Action stations were called, the klaxon rang, and the sailor I was with dashed out of the room.
Us officers knew what Harrison was about. I mean, some of the older ones did too. I couldn't help but smile when I saw some of them manning their stations all ready for battle. Others were just sharpening their knives. I ordered the whaler lowered and sent some of the men out for the spoils.
By the time I had heard it wasn't a submarine, the whaler was already on the water. I stood at the rail and couldn't believe what I was seeing. The men were hauling loads of fish. I ran back for my camera and took a few shots of the men posing with the catch. That night, Taft and the cooks fried them all up in some milk, and we had a feast.
By April 17th, Trentonian was back in Halifax. The crew was tasked with repainting the ship. While this occurred, a new radar unit was installed, and 4 more Oerlikon guns were added to defend against air attack. This started rumors among the crew as there was very little risk of an air assault on the vessel on this side of the Atlantic. Then, on April 18th, the crew received new paychecks for overseas duties. Harrison took the opportunity of time to write a letter to Miss Hazel Farley. He thanked her for her efforts in securing the washing machine and expressed his hope that it would arrive soon. The people of Trenton were kept up to date about the ship, and Hazel kept every letter that Harrison sent her. Harrison had also sent 2 photographs of the crew to be shown to the students of Trenton High School who were so diligent in writing. One of the photos is still on display at the Quinte West City Hall and Public Library. The morning of April 23rd broke over Halifax and glinted on the fresh paint job and newly refurbished hull of Trentonian. All stores and supplies had been replenished and loaded, guns had been tested, and half the crew had even had shore leave. Everything was prepared and ready for sea when Lieutenant Harrison called the crew together.
Orders had come in that morning, and I felt it necessary to address the crew regarding our new role. I told them the news. We are going to England. Take a good look, boys. This will be the last time we see Canada for quite some time.
It was a weird feeling. Here we are at war, but not at war. I mean, don't get me wrong. There was always a U-boat threat, and certainly some ships were attacked and sank on the home side while we were running our escorts. But England? Well, that's going to war. Those anti-aircraft guns took on a dread new significance.
Trentonian arrived in Londonderry Island on May 1st, 1944, accompanied by Louisburg II and Lindsay, when news arrived of the sinking of Valleyfield off the coast of Newfoundland. Only 38 men survived, while 123 crew members and 2 passengers were killed. When stoker Sidney Coates heard the news, he paled.
It struck me pretty hard. Valleyfield was the ship I had been assigned to and missed the call for back in Quebec City. If I hadn't missed that call, those 7 days in the brig feel a bit different now.
It was during their days in Londonderry when Trentonian received an additional, albeit tiny, crew member. A small dog made its way onto the deck and voluntarily stayed. The crew loved the furry little terrier, and it certainly appeared as if the terrier loved them. After some discussion and the setting of ground rules, the dog was allowed to stay, and the crew gave him a rank and designation. Able Seaman O'Brien was their first and only canine recruit. Signalman Jack Harold was assigned his primary caregiver, and they even slung a small hammock close to the ground in the communications mess, where he could sleep. After the 11-day crossing and an additional 20 days of battle training, the crew was granted leave. This included anti-submarine officer Lieutenant Dodds and the navigator Lieutenant Parr. As they waited on dock for a cab, Parr grabbed Dodds' cap and tucked it under his arm as if it were a football, and sprinted off down the jetty as if making for a touchdown. Dodds ran after him, caught up, and tackled Parr to the ground. A horrendous sound that Jack Harold described as a crack heard around the fleet was followed by the screams of Parr. As the men on board gathered at the railing, an ambulance was called to tend to Parr. Terrible news, his femur had been broken in the tackle. Dodds was ordered to the captain's berth. Not long after, the crew could hear the verbal lashing that Dodds was getting from Harrison, which included the line, "This childish act has now endangered the ship and men." A temporary navigation officer was assigned and reported to Trentonian the next day, Lieutenant John Macbeth. Harrison and the new officer spent most of the day in Harrison's cabin, going over plans that would soon be underway. On May 23rd, Trentonian left for Oban, Scotland. They would arrive to a harbour filled with ships. Lieutenant Harrison was assigned senior officer to an escort group, which included Mayflower, Drumheller, Rimouski, and Lindsay. And on May 31st, the escort ships left the harbour first, sweeping the ocean with their Aztec systems, always on the hunt for U-boats. 60 ships, most of them old rust buckets, some of which had fought in World War I, made up the convoy, making its way slowly into the Irish Sea, which was filled with traffic. Other convoys passed them going in the opposite direction. Bombers and other aircraft were seen flying overhead. Unlike the other side of the Atlantic, there was much commotion here. The convoy made way into the English Channel and was passed by an American and a British battle fleet. They continued along, moving at 5 knots so the old merchant vessels wouldn't be left behind. On June 4th, signalman Jack Harold relayed a message to Harrison. Exercise delayed 24 hours. Anchor in Poole Bay. The convoy altered course. On June 5th, 1944, Lieutenant Harrison informed the crew the invasion of Europe was 24 hours away. Operation Overlord was about to commence, and Trentonian, along with her convoy, was going to the beachhead at Normandy to participate in Operation Neptune, the naval division of the assault.
I couldn't believe it. Here we were, thousands of miles from Canada, about to participate in the largest naval operation in history as part of the largest land invasion in history, and I have to admit, I was anxious. I was a strange blend of nervous and excited. I grabbed my camera and headed on deck and remembered looking around my makeshift darkroom, and my first thought was, I need more wires. And my second thought was, I really hope I'll need them. And that got me thinking about my preparedness as a medic. The equipment. I didn't want to need any of that.
As Trentonian, Drumheller, Rimouski, Lindsay, and Nasturtium entered Poole Bay with their convoy and bombers flew endlessly overhead, the immensity of the invasion force became clear. The The warships anchored here represented almost every type of ship in commission. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, corvettes like Trentonian, minesweepers, and troop ships bobbed on the ocean waves. As night fell over the warships and older merchant vessels in Poole Bay, an orange glow could be seen in the sky on the far side of the channel. The bombers had begun their part in the assault. Harrison ordered the men to action stations. Shifts were 4 hours on, 4 hours off. This allowed for everyone to get enough rest, even if sleep was difficult in such short breaks. The morning of June 6, 1944 broke to bright flashes on the eastern horizon and the constant roar of airplanes flying overhead toward the French mainland.
I was on deck that morning, having just come off duty. I had to get a sense of what was happening out there. The sky was dark with aircraft. Bombers, fighters, cargo planes, all heading towards France. There were now also planes coming back from the battle, some smoking and some of their engines sounding pretty rough. We had received notice that the land invasion had begun and tens of thousands of troops were in France moving inland. I looked towards the flashes and lights to the east and wondered, how on earth could anyone be alive under all of that?
Harrison ordered the lower decks of the ship evacuated and sealed to minimize risk to the crew in the case of an attack. This crowded the upper level messes and made their cramped life even more uncomfortable. But every man understood the necessity. That afternoon, Harrison gathered the men on deck immediately before their departure from Poole Bay.
I had heard some of the rumors being spread by the men. They had little news of the invasion itself, aside from what they could pick up on the BBC through the radios. Anxiety was high, and they needed to understand that things in France were going well. I explained that air and naval bombardment of shore positions had been effective.
It became clear now why we were escorting around these old rusty tubs. They were going to be sunk to provide defense positions and impede movement of German vessels. I couldn't believe that we were heading directly towards the largest assault to ever take place. I hope you didn't meet any U-boats or German warships on the way. Although, looking at the firepower around and overhead, I felt safe on board the Trentonian, whether that was reasonable or not.
Operation Overlord had actually begun when Trentonian's convoy left Oba. It was the first movement of naval vessels in what was a highly complex order of operations to commence the assault. It also became clear to the men why Harrison had been so enraged at Lieutenant Parr's injury. Parr had spent weeks studying the invasion, plans, maps, memorizing the routes, and where the barrier ships in the convoy were to be sunk. These locations were code-named Gooseberry. His replacement, Lieutenant Macbeth, had only days to do the same. The convoy arrived at Area Z, the staging ground on the English side of the channel for any vessel entering the active assault zone. Minesweepers had cleared 7 wide channels approaching the beach, and navigational buoys had been installed that afternoon. The warships were to separate and escort the soon-to-be sunk merchant vessels towards shore down the specific channels. Trentonian and her convoy reached the minesweeper-cleared channels of the assault area at 0540 on June 7th. The escorted vessels were divided and each section was sent toward the American Gooseberries. The remaining ships were assigned to Gooseberry 4 off Juno Beach and number 5 off British Beach. By 11:55 that morning, Trentonian had successfully escorted 3 groups of ships to their necessary position along the beach and had escorted a tug back alongside the Manchester Spinner, a freighter piloted by the Commodore of this division. They dropped anchor just off Juno Beach.
We were stationed alongside HMS Roberts, a monitor ship that was providing artillery support to the troops inland. It only had 1 turret, with 2 15-inch monsters mounted on it. And let me tell you, whenever it fired, well, it sounded like the world ending. The deck rattled under your feet. I could feel the pressure on my chest. Those shells must have hit like the hand of God striking the ground.
At 1350, Trentonian was on the move again, escorting tugs to Gooseberry 3, where the ships were placed in a row to be scuttled. This was accomplished with great difficulty due to the roughness of the sea. Explosive charges had been laid throughout the ships, and the skeleton crews that maneuvered the vessels into position were evacuated. As the first vessel's charges were triggered, explosions ripped through the air and the ship immediately began to sink. At 1600, Trentonian left the area on orders to return to Area Z across the channel to receive the next load of Gooseberry-bound ships. They delivered these back to the French coast, arriving in the morning of June 8th. New orders were received that afternoon, and at 12:35, Trentonian churned back across the channel, leaving the Normandy coast for Portsmouth, along with Louisbourg II. It had been 2 days since D-Day, and although there was still ample traffic on the water, there were also casualties. HMS Lawford, a Royal Navy frigate, had been converted to a headquarters for the invasion and had been bombed that morning. Its stem and stern stuck up out of the water like a child's toy that had been smashed in the middle. Somewhere under the dark waters, its smashed middle lay on the bottom. 37 men had died in the attack.
As we left the coast, a few of us stood on deck. Singleton was there with his camera, taking photos the whole time, and I got him to snap a couple just for me. By that time, he had begun taking orders for photographs and developing them in the sickbay. He had a real business going back there. Anyway, just as I was wondering how the troops were doing inland, I caught a glimpse of something up ahead floating in the water. As it got closer, I realized it was the body of a soldier bobbing along in his life jacket, an American flag on his shoulder. He bumped up alongside the ship, just kind of sliding down the side of us, and there was a bird picking at the flesh of his face. I'll never forget that for as long as I live.
Trentonian crossed the channel without incident and anchored off Portsmouth Harbour at 1925 on the evening of June 8, 1944. The crew were given a rest, but no leave.